Thank you everyone for joining us, and welcome to our webinar on an important historic resource, one that helped establish what we know today as Texas, but one that you might not have heard about until now, the El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail. I am Brad Patterson, your host for this afternoon's talk and Director of Community Heritage Development at the Texas Historical Commission. One of the programs in our division is Heritage Tourism, and I serve as a liaison with the National Park Service for the National Historic Trails in Texas, with their associations and stakeholders. We have a terrific panel of speakers with you today to discuss the Camino. We have Stephen Gonzalez, Executive Director of the nonprofit El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association. Tony Souther, Site Manager for the Texas Historical Commission's Caddo Mounds State Historic Site, and Amanda McVeigh, Site Manager for the THC's Mission Dolores State Historic Site. We welcome your questions and plan to leave time at the end of the session to address them. Please use the Q&A feature, including while the session is in progress. Depending on your device, the Zoom toolbar will be either at the very top or very bottom of your screen. Move your mouse there or tap your mobile device and then click or tap on the icon that says Q&A. If you don't see it, look for a three-dot icon that says more, and that should be able to access the Q&A for you. Next slide. So today we'll discuss the trail from a few different directions, but we hope with this webinar you'll understand the significance of the trail and why it deserves commemoration and preservation. We also hope to inspire you to get out and travel the trail and see some of the sites we highlight, as well as the varied communities and landscapes along the route. While we're going to focus on a few sites today, there are many more open and waiting to be explored. Next slide. Now, I don't know what each of you were expecting today, but it probably wasn't this. This is actually an image from 1972 of a camel in an El Camino. It was taken in San Antonio, so technically I think what we have here is a camel in an El Camino on the El Camino Real. Next slide. So this is really what we're talking about today. Places where you can stand on the trail and see the path made by far more than 300 years of travel. To me, it's powerful to be on the El Camino and to contemplate all of those who passed through that very same location that you're standing, those who saw a similar landscape, and to consider what their experience was, whether it's indigenous, French, Spanish, Mexican, Texian, free or enslaved Americans. So many people have passed through this for centuries. It's just a powerful, moving moment to be in one of these places where you can really experience and see the trail. On the left is Lobanillo Swells, a site that Stevens Association has saved from destruction and open to the public. This view is prior to the walking trail development on the site, but what you're seeing is one of the 5 parallel depressions or swales that are the results of all the travelers and wagons taking this route. The trees have grown up within the swales in the absence of travelers, but you can get the idea here. Historical and archaeological records tell us that these are not natural formations or drainage ditches, but evidence of the trail itself. In fact, archaeologists working extensively on the Camino in other locations have been able to establish differences in the soil chemistry on and off the trail due to the chemicals in the leather footwear of the travelers. They also look at other evidence that they find along the trail of encampment sites, just lots of different ways they can actually realize once you know what you're looking for that you're seeing the actual Camino. On the right-hand side is a vast rock outcropping at McKinney Falls State Park, and you can see the path worn across the rocks. The trail isn't this evident everywhere that we go. Some places it's been destroyed, paved over, or turned into roadways. And in other sections, we don't yet know the exact locations. Next slide. Now that you've seen it on the ground, let's step back to the larger view. The El Camino de los Tejas has been designated by Congress as part of the National Trail System and is a National Historic Trail. On the left, you can see a national map of both historic and scenic national trails. Currently, there are only 19 National Historic Trails, so it's a select company that the Camino keeps. However, there are several potential trails pending for designation and development that would include Texas if they move forward. Shown on the right, El Camino Real de los Tejas is a 2,600-mile network across Texas, connecting Mexico City to what is now Louisiana. What is not shown on the map is an additional about 700 miles from the Rio Grande to Mexico City that is really part of this historic network. The Camino Reals were transportation routes from Spanish colonial capitals to outlying capitals, missions, mines, and other royal resources of the king. So there are other Camino Reals, including one that passes through the El Paso area as it connects Mexico City to the settlements north of Santa Fe. You can see a sample of the road signs used along the route. The National Park Service, the Nonprofit Trail Association, our office, all coordinate on the sign design, production, and installation with the local jurisdictions or with TxDOT. The entire trail is not yet completely signed. After all, it's 26 miles, so we still have a little bit ways to go on that. Next slide. So here on the screen are descriptions of the three primary types of trails that comprise the National Trail System: scenic, historic, and recreational. It's important to note what the trails are and are not. They are managed as units of the National Park Service and occasionally other governmental agencies like Bureau of Land Management. However, they are not parks in any traditional sense. Large portions of the designated routes, the vast majority in Texas, is privately owned. Nothing in the establishment of the trails makes them public property or opens access to the public on private land. In most cases, including the El Camino, National Park Service is actually legally prohibited from acquiring land for the trail, which is one of the reasons the association stepped up to save a site like Lobinio Swales. Next slide. To be considered for National Historic Trail status, it must be a definable, historically important route. It has to be of national significance as a route that dramatically impacted American culture. It does also have to have the potential for public visitation and for travel. Next slide. Before we turn this over to Stephen Gonzalez, let's look at how the National Trails criteria apply specifically to the El Camino. The establishment of the missions and presidios along the trail was a direct reaction to the perceived French interest in the region and began a prolonged settlement effort by the Spanish, setting off the chain of events leading to where we are today. The route served indigenous cultures prior to Spanish settlement, but the trail brought cultures into contact with the Spanish and to some degree the French at the eastern end of the trail. It's worth noting that evidence and logic suggests that the Camino routes were used for thousands of years before the arrival of the Spanish. Indigenous settlements can be documented up and down the trail in a specific alignment and vicinity of the trail. These were trade routes used extensively among the indigenous cultures, and the Spanish came and adopted them. The trails were critical. The trail was critical to the Spanish conquest and colonization. And I note here that historic significance is not a value judgment of good or bad. It's based on the historical fact. Next slide. The route established this route established the settlement patterns and even the transportation routes that we see today, became a major transportation corridor and the primary overland route for commerce and immigration. It'd be hard to imagine the Texas and the country we have today without the Camino Real. Now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk a bit about the history of the trail, the important work and partnership of the Trail Association to sustaining the trail and helping it reach its potential.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate it. My name is Steve Gonzalez. I'm Executive Director of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association. We're the official nonprofit partner of the National Park Service in the administration and development of the Camino. And we also work with other agency partners like the THC, Texas Parks, and Louisiana State Parks towards its administration. Today, I'm going to be talking about a few different things within my presentation. First, I'll be speaking about Spanish expeditions or entradas that blazed the initial routes of the Camino Real. Then I'll touch briefly on the early Anglo period of the trail. Then I will transition to modern events leading to the designation of the Camino as a National Historic Trail. And then I'll finish out with a little bit about who we are and what we do for the trail as a nonprofit association. So, in 1685, the Frenchman La Salle landed on the Texas coast and established Fort St. Louis on Garcitas Creek in Victoria County. The Spanish took this as an incursion into their territory, and because of that, they began sending out entradas, or expeditions, in search of La Salle in order to run him out of Texas. And these expeditions were taken or undertaken both by land and by sea. Next slide, please. Over the next several years, expeditions by sea came out of places like Veracruz and Florida, but due to shallow bays and unnavigable rivers, they were unable to locate La Salle's fort this way. Next slide, please. At the same time, expeditions by land were taking place, and these were done by a gentleman named Alonso de Leon. And so beginning in 1686, de Leon left the town of Caddo, and he headed to the Rio Grande, and he headed to the mouth of the river. But rather than turning north into Texas, he headed south, and therefore he was heading towards Veracruz and away from where La Salle's fort would have been. So they returned home. A year later, the same thing happened. De Leon left Caddo. He headed to the Rio Grande, and he did head to the mouth of the river. This time he did turn north, and he headed into Texas. And he got as far as present-day Baffin Bay, which is near Kingsville. And the Spanish saw this as an impassable body of water, and they just said, you know what? These are just rumors. The French aren't really out here. So they turned around and went home. Yet those rumors persisted that there were white men living among the Native Americans. So a year later, in 1688, de Leon was able to capture the Frenchman Jean Giry, who was acting as a chieftain among some Native American tribes in the Anacacho Mountains. And with Jean Giry in tow, in 1689, de Leon was able to discover the ruins of Fort St. Louis. And it was in a complete shambles because it had been ransacked by Native Americans. There were French books with the pages torn out of them and just strewn about the landscape. There were 3 French bodies, including that of a woman still in her dress, that were there at the site, and the Spanish did give them proper burial. And the famed French cannons that are now in many museums across the state were found at that time by the Spanish and buried in case the French did return. Next slide, please. And of that 1689 expedition, famed Spanish colonial historian Carlos Castaneda states that it truly marks the beginnings of Texas, because this is the first time that these expeditions were penetrating as far as the Guadalupe River. And around that same time, Maria de Agreda, the lady in blue who you see pictured here, miraculously appeared to the Tejas Indians in East Texas and said to them that they should seek out the Spanish to learn about the Catholic faith. The Tejas did, in fact, then journey to reach out to the Spanish, and they invited them to their kingdom in East Texas. Next slide, please. And therefore, de Leon did journey to the kingdom of the Tejas. And at the Neches River on June the 1st of 1690, Mission San Francisco de los Tejas had been established. So Spanish missionary aspirations and the beginnings of El Camino Real had been laid. Next slide, please. So over the next several years, the Camino became a major route that facilitated a lot of trade and travel along it. In 1700, the Mission and Presidio of San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande was founded. By 1714, the French established Natchitoches on the eastern end of the trail. And the Spanish once again took this as an incursion into their territory. And due to that, in 1717, they established Los Adais in present-day Louisiana, about 15 miles west of Natchitoches. So you had these 2 imperial powers who considered that they were considered themselves standing out in the wilderness, even though they were surrounded by Native Americans. A year later, in 1718, the Villa of San Fernando de Bahar and the Alamo were founded in San Antonio. So as you can see, the Camino was really becoming a major route of travel and allowing the flow of people across it into Texas and Louisiana. Next slide, please. And if we fast forward about 100 years to 1820, Moses Austin came down the Camino into San Antonio, where he was able to obtain a Spanish land grant to establish a Spanish colony here in Texas, which we all know is the famed Austin Colony. And around that same time, many Anglo-American colonists began entering Texas at Gaines Ferry on the Sabine and coming into places like Nacogdoches, San Antonio, and other places in the interior along the road. Even famed Alamo combatant Davy Crockett came into San Antonio to the Alamo along the Camino in 1836. And it can be said that if he had not met his fate at that battle, that he would have continued down the Camino to San Juan Bautista, because in his last known extant letter, he did say exactly that. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to transition to the modern history of the Camino and events leading up to its designation as a National Historic Trail. So the modern history of the Camino begins in 1915 when the Texas legislature appropriated approximately $5,000 to V.N. Zivley to survey the route of the Camino. Over the next couple of years, Zivley did survey one route of the trail. And along that route by 1918, markers such as this one that you see here were placed. And they say Kings Highway, Camino Real, Old San Antonio Road, marked by the Daughters of the American Revolution and the state of Texas, AD 1918. These markers are historic in themselves now, as they are over 100 years old. And it was actually a special honor of mine that in 2018 in San Antonio, at the DAR conference that was taking place that year, we actually did a presentation on the Camino that day, celebrating that 100th anniversary celebration. By 1929, the road from the old San Antonio Road became designated as a as a historic trail of Texas. And this was the first time that in the state's history that a roadway had been designated as a historic highway in the state. And it wasn't until 2011 that the entirety of the Camino was designated as a historic highway of the state. And that was only the second time in the state's history that that happened. And by 1949, most of the road from San Antonio to the Sabine had been paved. So the old Caliche Road that used to have wagons rolling down it now had automobiles zooming into the future. Next slide, please. And if we fast forward about 40 years or so, in 1991, the old San Antonio Road Preservation Commission instructed TxDOT to survey the condition of the Camino. And this was done to commemorate the 300th anniversary of those entradas that De Leon was taking in the 1690s. That TxDOT study determined that there were at least 5 different routes of the Camino used at various times. And it also served as the basis for the National Park Service to conduct a feasibility study to determine whether or not the Camino met the criteria of being designated as a National Historic Trail. That feasibility study did determine that the Camino in fact met that criteria. So on October 18, 2004, El Camino Real de los Tejas was designated as a National Historic Trail and part of the National Trail System. Next slide, please. So that was just a brief history of the Camino, both in its historic context and in more modern times. If you are interested in learning more about the history of the trail, please visit our website, which is elcaminotrail.org, and click on our news and events link. And there you can see a sublink that says books and reference materials. And there are over 500 different materials where you can learn more about the trail's history. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about our association and what we do for the trail. So we do many things for the trail. We'd like to talk about our efforts in the acronym of PEEP: protect, educate, engage, and promote. And we do this in many different ways. For instance, in the protection aspect of things, as Brad noted earlier, we purchased a piece of the Camino Real in June of 2014. And we became the first National Historic Trail organization in the country to actually own a piece of a National Historic Trail. Over the next several years, we did archaeological studies at the site, and we worked with agency partners, the National Park Service, the THC, Sabine County, and others to make that site publicly accessible. It's now open 7 days a week, free of charge to the public, and it's about 10 miles east of Mission Dolores State Historic Site. So when you're out in that area, we encourage you to visit both and learn more about the trail in East Texas. Other things that we do in order to protect the trail include things such as working with landowners to certify their properties as official sites on the trail. A good example of that occurred in the Rio Grande in Milam County in recent years. We worked with 3 families to do studies on their trail, both historic research and archaeological studies. And we found things that had never before been discovered. We found actual remnants of the physical road on many of the properties. We found multiple Native American village sites, and we found more Native American projectile points than you can possibly imagine. And so all 3 of those families have now certified their sites as official parts of the trail, adding that level of protection to them that they recognize they have a significant historic resource on their property. And prior to the pandemic, occasionally those properties were opened for visitation, and we expect they will be so again. We also do things like engage and educate people about the National Historic Trail, and we can do this in multiple ways. For instance, we engage local elected officials such as county judges, county commissioners, city council people, and we work with them as well as TxDOT and the THC and the Park Service, to install roadway signs on modern roads that mirror the historic routes of the Camino Real. And so the entirety of the trail crosses 40 counties and 2 parishes. And at this point in time, we have about 20 of those counties signed in one way or another with roadway signing or other locational signing that are specific to the Camino. We also work to do educational outreach to the public about the trail. And we do that through efforts such as this, webinars. We sometimes have in-person presentations in various locations across the trail. And we also do things like guided hikes along sections of the trail in places like San Antonio and Floresville and here in Austin. So in order to learn more about these events, I do encourage you to visit our website, elcaminotrail.org, or follow us on Facebook or Instagram to learn more about those upcoming activities. Next slide, please. So with that said, as I wrap up here is my contact information. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization. And so I encourage you to visit our website, elcaminotrail.org, and find out more about us. And if you find that we're worthy of your support, please click on the Support Us tab and make a donation or become a member today. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Tony Souther at this point. Thank you.
As said, I'm Anthony Souther. I'm site manager at Caddo Mounds, State Historic Site. It is one of the locations along the modern day El Camino Real. I will talk about a little bit about history and the current site. Next slide. I've may have a very slow, next slide. Caddo were active at during the Mississippi Mound building period here in Texas that ranged from approximately 750 AD to 1650 of the contact period. At their zenith, approximately AD 1000 to 1200, the Caddo had a rich and vibrant that was no less complex than ours today. The Caddo occupied this site from around 750 AD to 1320. At the beginning of the contact period, which would have been 1690, we heard San Francisco de los Tejas established. The Caddo were organized in 25 to 26 into tribal groups, and those were organized into 3 loose confederacies. Here in the southern area where Caddo Mounds is was the Hassine. Up on the upper Red River was the Caddo Hadacho, and on the lower Red River area was the Natchitoches. Each of the independent tribal groups consisted of a stratified social structure with a small ruling class, tradesmen, and common villagers. The ruling elite for each tribe or band consisted of a hereditary chieftain, which meant the son could inherit that position from his father. Below that were counselors, captains, or kanahas, as they were called, and below that level were tamas, and they helped to organize communal activity in the Caddo area. Next slide, please. The Caddo did have a complex cosmology, at least their belief system, their religion. They believed in a supreme being that had created the world and people that lived in it. They believed in an afterlife. They believed that death, it took 6 days to travel to that afterlife, and that was in the heaven, skies above, and they believed that they became the stars that we see tonight. They also had rituals that guided their daily life. Next slide. As far as that daily life, the Caddo were sedentary agrarian farmers who lived in permanent homes in villages. Many of the daily tasks, such as preparing fields for planting, harvesting crops, and house building, were carried out as a community-wide undertaking. As you can see in this image, the Caddo lifestyle was really no different from ours. They lived in pretty elaborate houses. You can see them in this imagery preparing food for sustenance. You can see them preparing and making pottery, as well as some of the men doing flint knapping that allowed them to go out and hunt and do their daily activities. Next slide. At least one of the things you would ask is why here? This village site is built on a high plateau, and it provides a safe haven from flooding. The Tejas River is only 1.5 miles from here, and I can guarantee you that when the Tejas River overflows, it will come up to the ridge that surrounds Caddo Mounds. This plateau is on 3 sides of where the village area ceremonial center was located. Next slide. Next slide. Another possible reason is the proximity to trade routes. As you can see from this map, the Caddo were well situated for both north-south and east-west trade roads. One thing that we don't know, at least for Caddo Mounds, was the ceremonial center at Caddo Mounds built because of the road that may have been next to it, or did the road come here because of the ceremonial center? When I talk about the ceremonial center, I would like to say that it includes a burial mound, a temple mound, and a low ceremonial mound. Next slide. How do we know the road ran here? One of the reasons is we have a swell located here at Caddo Mounds, as well as ruts and archaeology. The map that you are seeing right now is a magnetometer image. It is non-intrusive archaeology that shows what's underground without having to dig in the ground. On this northern portion of this map, you can actually see where the roadbed ran. Anytime there is traffic across the ground, it compresses the soil underneath it. And this was compressed so far down that even plowing did not obscure where the road ran. This section, next slide, the next section up on the upper left was a perpetual campground for the Spanish. You can at least see, hopefully, in the image that you may have coming up, this is at least what we believe the Spanish may have seen as they crossed the Tejas River, only 1.5 miles from us, traveled to the ridge, up the ridge, and onto the high plateau. They would have had a perfect place to camp. And that area just north of the burial mound that you saw on the map before us actually was a perfect area for the Spanish to stop and camp the night. There was food for their animals. There was a place to stay up and above any flooding that may occur at the river. What you just saw was at least our modern day trailhead. This is our swell area as it comes off of the plateau, going down the swell off of the ridge into the floodplain area. And this is one of the narrative panels that we have at the El Camino Real interpretive area. And it's kind of shows you what it what a day on the El Camino could have been like for the Spanish. It would have been a road for the missionaries, the soldiers coming into this area and leaving this area, as well as traders. Next slide. What I will be talking about now is some present day activities here at Caddo Mounds. Go ahead and hit next slide. We renovated the museum in 2013 and reopened it to the public in the fall of 2014. The renovation, larger exhibit space, and and then only 5 years later, 5 years later, we were actually hit by like we are here. Next slide. I'm at least going to go ahead with the presentation. We were hit by a tornado in April of 2019. This is at least an image from that. Next slide. This image was taken the day after the tornado hit. It did impact the museum. We were having Caddo Culture Day. That day, there were about 80 people in the museum. From this experience, we did learn a new word. Shaho is a Caddo word for tornado experience. And it describes, it's not a word for the tornado, but everything involved with the tornado. Next slide. Some of the next imagery that you may see is actually some of the devastation that took place. One of the slides is a close-up aerial of the museum, and each of those dots represents where a person was after the tornado departed. In red, you can see where I was located, and what was the classroom next to that space is where my wife was. She is circled in yellow, and she took cover under a plastic table, and I will never talk bad about plastic tables again. Next slide. In January of 2020, 9 months after the tornado, we did reopen the grounds at Caddo Mounds. We opened up a temporary visitor center. This is at least the opening day event with some of the friends there. Next slide. We are in the process of rebuilding the museum right now. Some of the next images are at least showing the new museum or the concept for the new museum building, and hopefully one day an education activities center. Phase 1 is the museum, phase 2, the education activities center. We are in the process of raising money for that phase 2 process. So if anybody has a spare $1.5 million that they don't know what to do with, this could be a worthy project. Next slide. The next image you hopefully will see is at least where we're at in the actual building process. We have got block walls going up, and next we will see roof supports going in and the roof itself, and then they will complete the walls and start working on the interior of this building. You also see Snake Woman's interpretive garden here, and it survived the tornado and actually flourished. Next slide. One of the projects that we are undertaking here at Caddo Mounds right now is the Caddo grass house, which we had built in 26. It was all by the we're material this winter and hope to build it in the summer. Next slide. I'm going to go quick through these next slides. What we've for the last couple of years, we have tried to include the Caddo in the planning of projects and programs as much as possible. And two of those that are underway right now are the Caddo Voices virtual tour. It's where Caddo tell their own stories, and they will be connected to a virtual website. Somebody can click on an image and then hear Caddo talking about their own culture. Through one of the Caddo artists, Chase Earls, we are also hoping to get a Caddo basket project going where split cane basketry is reintroduced to the Caddo Nation. There will be a handful of Caddo that are taught by other Native American basket makers to try and reintroduce this skill back into the Caddo Nation. Next slide. These are just some general site projects that we are doing here at Caddo Mounds. This is our third growing season for prairie restoration. We've got 50 acres in plant, and we're hoping to get another 30 additional acres into prairie restoration on the north side of the property. We are also in the process of adding about another mile of trail to the El Camino Real interpretive area. Next slide. The next slide that you will see are just some of the more general programs that we are starting to do again. We have just had a plant foraging program with Meriwether, and so it took place, some of it took place over in the El Camino Real area. We have a stargazing program planned for the 1st of December. And we are starting to get school groups again. We had a school group this morning before the webinar, and there's another school group coming after this webinar. So today, Caddo Mounds has been extremely busy. Next slide. I am again having pretty slow loading for the slides, so I don't know what everybody else may be seeing. But after all of these images come up for just general public programming, if the controller can go ahead and take it to the last slide, I would like to invite everybody to come out to Caddo Mounds and experience the site for yourself. We are situated right on the State Highway 21, the modern day equivalent to the El Camino Real de los Tejas. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Amanda McVeigh from Mission Dolores State Historic Site, all the way in San Augustine, Texas, almost on the Louisiana border. And I provided a map for everyone from about 1770 that shows some of the missions that were in the area. So if you look all the way to the right of your screen, you'll see a red circle. That's Mission Dolores. And all the way on the left side of the screen is San Antonio. So that gives you an idea of the land that was covered on the El Camino Real. Next slide, please. So Mission Dolores was founded more than 300 years ago, and it was located along the El Camino Real. This was a trail that was created by indigenous people and continue to be used in the 18th century New Spain. Also, as we'll learn today, it's continued to being used. For the Spanish, the El Camino Real began in Mexico City and extended to Los Adayas, which is the easternmost presidio in modern-day Louisiana. So Mission Dolores was basically a stop on the eastern end of the trail. During its existence, Mission Dolores' existence was relatively unsuccessful in converting the local Irish and Native Americans to Roman Catholicism. This was their main goal with the Spanish mission, was to convert the indigenous population. As a result of them not being successful in their operations, the East Texas missions were systematically closed, including the one in Mission Dolores. And again, if you can see the image that is on the slide, this is an idealized version of what Mission Dolores probably looked like. We have no sketches that give us a hint to what Mission Dolores would have actually looked like. The closest we have are some blueprints from Los Adayas. That being said, many of these Spanish missions were short-lived, and some were never compromised with more than a few primitive structures made of wattle and daub and poles and mud with a thatched roof. And these missions were ultimately abandoned and are now represented by the archaeological remains of what was brought, used, and discarded at the site. And next slide, please. So this is what makes our site very interesting, one of the many things. These are some of our artifacts. And again, I mentioned these were what was brought, used, and discarded at the site. So when establishing a mission in a new location, missionaries brought with them everything that defined the mission as a religious entity. This included supplies, furnishings, religious vestments that were brought along the main branch of the El Camino. And some of these items you can see on your screen. These were items that were excavated from the archaeological area at Mission Dolores. So some of them may or may not be easy to identify. So I'll start, we'll go from 12 noon clockwise around back around. So the first image that you see in that very center middle is an adorno. And the second image to the right of that adorno is an additional adorno. And these were things that were placed on trunks or cases as they were carried through the El Camino Real to the missions or the next location for the travelers. The large item that looks like a fist is what is called a higa. And it was excavated at Mission Dolores. It's made of jet, and it's almost like a special good luck charm. It's kind of to help ward the evil eye away and to keep people safe as they traveled along the El Camino Real. The next two items that are towards the bottom left are excuse me, they are horse stirrups and spurs, as you can see, some of the metal pieces. And above the spur is part of a chocolate cup. So the Spanish would drink the special hot chocolate on special occasions at Mission Dolores, and we have proof of that with this chocolate cup. Next slide. So the El Camino was a transportation network. It was just not a single road. I always describe it to people as having kind of spider veins. There was one main branch, and off of the branch, it included the main route, the secondary trails, river crossings, and stopping places. And as you can see from the slide, the little church-looking chapel icon is right in the middle of El Camino Real, but it's also right on the middle of present-day Highway 147 that runs through San Augustine. And this is where we are located. Next slide. So how do we know that people traveled here? One way is we have the artifacts that give us the clue as to the people that traveled and what they brought with them. But another way that we know these roads were traveled are the swells. And as you can see, we have our own swells. At Mission Dolores, I like to call them our baby swells because they're little baby swells, but you can still see You can see Jeff, I believe that is Jeff Williams, one of the Friends Groups members at Caddo Mounds, standing in this well on the left, and on the right, we have the indention that the land makes for this well. Now, the multiple locations of certain missions were related to the changing routes of the trails and the social activity in which the trails developed. Because of this, we have the offshoots of the what we call the swells, or the offshoots of the main route of El Camino Real. Hundreds of years of people, wagons, and livestock traveling along the Camino resulted in U-shaped indentions called swells to form in these places, and these are our swells at Mission Dolores. The swells show where the ground would have been compressed and it would have sunk under the weight of many years of travelers, many years of wagons, many years of animals coming through. Next slide, please. And one thing that I find fascinating working and living on the El Camino Real is that it is still very much a major thoroughfare of Texas, or East Texas at least. As you can see, the pictures that are on display, some of them are from Mission Dolores, East Texas, but some of them, if y'all can identify, are actually from San Antonio. So the El Camino Real traveled quite a bit across East Texas. And today it's one of the more traveled routes in Texas, I would say. We get a lot of visitors doing the El Camino route from Mission Dolores. They either come from Natchitoches, Louisiana, and they're on their way to San Antonio, and they try to hit every El Camino site along the route. One thing about Mission Dolores is that we are still a perfect stop on the El Camino Real. We have our new museum. We also have a RV park. So if you are interested in doing the El Camino Real trail, there is a wonderful RV park here at Mission Dolores that you are welcome to call and get reservations. Next slide. And if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out to me, here's my contact information on the screen. And at this point, I will turn it over to Brad. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Amanda. I apologize, everybody, for the difficulty with Tony's audio. It's a relatively remote site, and we keep trying to do things to upgrade, but it's sometimes he's clear as a bell and sometimes not. And inevitably on a webinar, you know which way that goes. So thank you, everybody, for your patience on that. We're going to try to do some Q&A. We've answered a whole bunch of questions in the chat, in the Q&A features. So you're welcome to look at those. We'll highlight a few of those. But I'm going to start the conversation with a question that hasn't been answered yet. But Tony might be able to answer this verbally. The question is, what sort of goods were traded among the Caddoans and other tribes along the trail? Any interesting archaeological findings of artifacts? Kind of two different questions there. But Tony, do you have a first take at that? Maybe Stephen or Amanda? Tony, you're muted.
I'm going to go ahead and take my camera off as well, just so that it may improve my, hopefully the audio. Some of the items traded out from the Caddo area would have been bow dark or Osage orange wood. Caddo were well-known bow makers. And so the bow dark, Osage orange, horse apple are all names for the same tree. They would have been making bow blanks and trading those outside of their area, or possibly even completed bows. Salt was also another area that was traded out of at least the northeastern area, up around in the southwest corner of Arkansas. Northeast Texas, there are salt springs. So the Caddo would have been making salt from that salt brine and then trading that out. Here at Caddo Mounds, there was an ear spool uncovered in the burial mound that had a copper covering, and that brass would have come from the Wisconsin side of Lake Michigan. So that at least is an article that would have been traded into the Caddo area, either the ear spool made and covered in copper and then traded in, or the sheet copper traded in and a local craftsman making the ear spool.
Thanks, Tony. That brings up a question that sort of came up tangentially and was answered, but at the risk of not romantic or trying not to romanticize the early interactions, obviously it's pretty hard to argue that the European influence and conquest was a positive for the indigenous people. So I'm absolutely not arguing that. But there's a lot of evidence that there was a lot of collaboration, cooperation, and that while there were conflicts, there was also a lot of assistance provided by the indigenous people to the early Spanish settlers. And so there was a lot of interactions. There were ceremonial, there were travel back and forth, there were guides. So there was a lot that went on, early on with that, including particularly the trading aspects. Question here. Question was asked about how the river crossings were achieved. And I know particularly Tony and Stephen might have a take on that. I think they kind of just barreled through, but they spent a lot of time sometimes waiting for the rivers and creeks to go down. And that's part of why you see several different routes. It changed seasonally, it changed because of other influences. They would hit what they thought would be a place that they could traditionally ford the river or the creek, and they couldn't, and they would move up or down the creek until they could find a spot. So you see some of that, and you see it regularly and repeatedly over time. Anybody else have thoughts on that one?
I think that's a good question, Brad. River crossings and waterways are some of the best places that we can find the Camino because of the nature of waterways. These trails had to funnel down into certain locations. So if you can think of the bank of a river as an example, very often they have these very steep, banks. And so the travelers who were traveling the Camino, they had to find these places where those banks just kind of widened out and flattened out, and were these shallow rocky surfaces that they could cross along easily. A great example being McKinney Falls here in Austin. Another place would be Apache Pass out in Milam County, and there are just countless others across the trail. But those are some of the best places where we know we can see those remnants because of the fact they had to funnel down into those certain areas.
I hope I can be heard, but I would like to at least say, as you get into East Texas, you will note that on the map, you may have a northern and southern route, but then they come together at the only crossing that may be available. And then it spreads out again. You may have a southern and a northern route, and then it comes back together. So it is at these river crossings that there may only be one or two right close to each other, but the trail, at least on the map, does show that they come together back at the river.
And it kind of continues today. An interesting situation is that we think the location where the Camino probably predominantly crossed the Colorado River in Austin now, but to the east of what was Austin or became Austin, is actually also the most logical location that the Chisholm Trail and the cattle drives in the 1870s crossed the Colorado River. It was just a natural location to ford, and it's in the vicinity of a historic 1930s era bridge, the Montopolis Crossing. It's a little bit downriver to the east of that location. But that bridge is now being turned into a pedestrian bridge by TxDOT in the city. I wanted to also touch on the questions that kind of came up about what we call retracements. So actual on the ground locations where you can walk along the trail. There are lots of examples, and the Park Service and Stevens site highlight places where you can actually see the trail. A lot of them are very short segments. There's some longer segments in development. There's one in Floresville that is in the process of being signed and developed that you can actually walk along now, but it's not completely signed. Mission Tejas State Park, I think you can walk along that. And of course, Lobinio Swells that we talked about, it's a very short segment, but a very impressive segment that you can walk along. So that's part of the ongoing effort. A lot of it's highway signs thus far, but there are signs that direct you to very specific sites where you can get out of the car and experience portions of the trail. And over time, more and more of that will come. Now, some of those are still on private property and probably will be for perpetuity. So the public doesn't have access to those necessarily.
Yeah, Brad, if I could jump in real quick too, I think that it's important for people to know that a national historic trail like the Camino is composed of sites and segments. And so it's not your traditional hiking trail where you get on point A and you hike to point Z. You can drive portions of it. You can walk and bike portions of it. You can go to a site on the map like Mission Dolores or like the Alamo, that are places that you can see and experience. Caddo Mounds, let's not forget Caddo Mounds. Retracement trails are what is a term that the Park Service uses where we develop a physical hiking path on the ground that closely mirrors that historic route of the trail. As Brad just said a minute ago, the longest one we have in existence right now is in Floresville, and it's just about 3 miles long. We are working to extend that trail by a couple of miles in the area, and there's a vision to have a 33-mile hikeable, bikeable trail from Mission Espada to the Rancho de las Cabras there in Wilson County. But because of the nature of land ownership and things that we have to work with to have that development, it is several years out before something like that will actually be in place.
Another
Brad,
go ahead, Tony.
I would like to say at least trail number 2, one of the 3 trails we're working on opening up, will allow people to actually walk along the route of the El Camino. They will be on top of the route for at least a segment of that walking trail. And I hope to have those open within the next couple of weeks.
It just because it came up in this conversation, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Tony. Another question came up in a couple of different ways about what happens in Mexico, and that would be a webinar of its own. It's really interesting. Stephen and I have been involved with various National Park Service efforts called Dos Caminos, which are really meetings that we're having with officials from Mexico, university officials, government officials, from INA, which in a very general sense is their version of the National Park Service. It's different, but it's similar. And the trail is documented. It went through a lot of mining communities, major city villages, villas. So it's relatively well documented in Mexico. But it's Spanish colonial, and that isn't necessarily always the emphasis within Mexico and the interest. So it's a little bit neglected in some ways to the public. They approach it very, very differently than the National Park Service does, but we're having ongoing joint efforts to share data, understand what all of the different jurisdictions have, because we're also talking about the state of Louisiana, the state of Texas, the National Park Service. On the other route, the Western Camino, we're talking about Texas, New Mexico, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and a lot of different entities in Mexico. So it's a very long-term effort, but there's an interest in having visions of the trail that are sort of united so that a visitor can go into Mexico or vice versa, come into the US and continue that experience, because you really miss something if you're only in one of the 2 countries. It's sort of the meaning of the trail. So we're working on that. We're gonna, I think, unless it automatically cuts us off, we're gonna keep trying to answer a few more of these questions. We have a lot in the chat. We also have the ability to answer questions and send out answers in some form or fashion to all the participants. So if we didn't get to your question, we will do our best to figure out a way to do that for you. But there was a question about, is anything being done to preserve the Caddo language? So Tony, are you able to hear that and answer that one?
Yes, the Caddo are trying to preserve their language. One young lady, Elena Talate, has gone to university with the intent of studying language, with the ultimate intent of preserving her own language, Caddo. COVID did hit the Caddo hard. A lot of their fluent speakers actually succumbed to COVID and passed away. So they did lose a good number of their fluent speakers. But there is an attempt to keep that language going. There's an actual language class that Elena holds and others. They've got tapes of older tapes where they've preserved their language. So she is falling back on that as a way of trying to recover, reclaim, and perpetuate the Caddo language.
All right, let's see, what else do we have here? If we don't get cut off. Feel free, other speakers, to jump in if there was something. I know, Stephen, you answered a lot of questions as we went on. So if there's something you want to highlight, bring up, feel free to jump in here.
I'm following your lead, Brad. So whatever questions you're comfortable with, yes.
I'm scrolling through them. I'm trying to get you. Let me check the open ones. Yeah, there's a couple of questions about the trail in Floresville. It follows the railroad tracks. Stephen, I don't know if you have a more specific exact location. I know where it is, but I don't know how to describe it.
It's an abandoned rail corridor. Excuse me. So it's a rail to trail conversion there in the city. And it's right next to Goliad Road, which is the old Camino that would have gone between San Antonio and Goliad. It runs from, one of the main trailheads is at Trail Street and Goliad Road. It can also be accessed via the Riverbend Country Club on its northwestern portion. And so there's signing all along it as far as pedestrian signing goes. And we've recently worked with the National Park Service and local citizens in Floresville to create interpretive panels and orientation panels so that people can understand the history of the trail in the area and where they are in relation to other trail segments. There's also a lot of potential development going on in, as I said a minute ago, in the coming months and years. We will be having our annual meeting in Floresville in April. And we're looking at having a visioning opportunity walk along that trail so that we can work with the public to see what y'all would like to see as far as developments in that area and how we might be able to extend that trail into the longer corridor that we're hoping for. So once again, visit our website, elcaminotrail.org, or our Facebook or Instagram page in the future to learn more about that.
Thanks, Stephen. A question came up that I think maybe a couple of people had certainly. Is there a website or a resource that shows the precise alignment of the Camino? And in one of the answers, we did put the National Park Service website. We put a few different websites. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but there isn't exactly this. The Park Service site allows you to zoom in pretty significantly, but I think purposely doesn't let you get too close in, partly because of all the privately owned land, and also because we don't, or collectively, we don't want to suggest that we always know exactly where the alignment is. There's a lot of approximation over that 2,600 mile network. It's amazing what we do know, but there are questions being answered all the time on the ground with research. So I think probably the spirit of the answer, there isn't a site that's going to give you that real precise alignment, although I think Stephen's organization has storybook kind of features and mapping that actually gets you a little closer in than the Park Service site.
Right, that's true. On our website, we do have a Travel the Trail interactive map, and you can see our interactive story map there, as well as there is also a link to the National Park Service's map. And you're right, Brad, the official designated trail line that we see on those maps was created at a 1 to 100,000 scale. And so it wasn't really designed to be zoomed in on so that we're looking at something, at a real up close level. And when we do that, you can, on our site, for example, see where those lines are, but that's just a general idea of where we think it may be. In order to find some of these segments, we need to do additional historic and archaeological research to confirm, is that actual historic road maybe a quarter mile to the left or right of that trail line, maybe it's a half a mile away. And so it's just a generalization that you're looking at there, but it's the best approximation that we have at this point. And it's the officially designated National Historic Trail that you're looking at when you do look at those maps. And it could change in the future. So if there was more studies done, as an example, right now in Austin, we're looking at a study route from southern Travis County, essentially from Menchaca Springs through Onion Creek Metropolitan Park to McKinney Falls State Park, where the trail would join in with the currently congressionally designated trail. So once we're doing historic research right now, and we're hoping to do archaeology in the future to confirm that that route was actually there. We do know through the record that Aguayo, as an example, passed along that route in 1721 to cross at McKinney Falls. And so the trail line that you do see now on those maps, it can change in the future, but it does take historic research and sometimes archaeology in order to make those changes.
Well, with that and looking at the questions, I know we have a bunch that are unanswered. They're very specific. So we're going to try to find a way to answer those and get those answers out to everybody. But I think we'll go ahead and conclude this or give concluding thoughts. Really appreciate everybody's time and attention on this. And, if you get a chance, get out there, get on the little portions of the trail that are available. It's ever increasing. It can be really powerful, and just the landscape and the opportunity to think about, how different it was and the impact these locations had on the development of Texas, the United States, Mexico, and Spain, for that matter. The importance of this is hard to actually understate, which makes it amazing that most people probably have no idea that this exists. And if they pass the signs, they don't really know the meaning of that yet. So we're going to change all that, but it's a pretty long, slow process. Any closing comments from my other panelists?
Thank you very much to everyone who participated.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I would encourage everybody to get on the trail and visit Mission Dolores and Caddo Mounds. And while you're out this way in East Texas, I would definitely suggest that you visit Lavinia soils. They are very impressive, and I think it really drives home what travel along the trail was like. Thank you.
Caddo Mounds, I would like to say that the house you see in this image is the house that we're going to be collecting material for this winter and rebuilding this summer. So if anybody wants to get involved in that, they can go to our Facebook page and sign up on our work days. Just show interest and come out to Caddo Mounds. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.